Uhuru. Uhuru. I want to thank Comrade Ann for the introduction, and I want to also express my appreciation to the Uhuru Solidarity Movement for initiating this meeting on today. That's a part of a series of meetings that we'll be having around the country, as you've already heard. And I want to express my appreciation to you for coming out on today. Is that the lovely child that I want to, she hates this, but I would really like for Deanne Lewis to come up just a minute. I want you to see her. And this is the sister of Tyron Lewis, who would have been 40 years old today. They killed him when he was 18. I wanted her to stand here because too often when these crimes, these offenses are made against our community and people die and stories are made up, fabricated, and what you will see in the newspaper after every murder is a picture, a photo, a mugshot that is used to justify murdering. This was an 18-year-old child that they killed. He still had baby fat in his face. And they concocted a story about him having stolen a car and that crack cocaine was in the car and that he had tried to run over the cops who killed him. It was an absolute fabrication. And they knew it. The state knew it. The bourgeois media knew it. And in fact, on the first year anniversary of his death, the St. Petersburg Times ran a lengthy article telling how the James Knight, who had killed Tyron Lewis, who had fired the weapons, fired the rounds that killed him, obviously lied. They told how he had claimed he was hit by the car with such force that it knocked him on the top of the hood. And the Times ran an article saying the guy had on short pants and that they took photos right after. There was not a bruise on his legs at all, and that there was no fingerprints of him on the hood of the car, just on the front of the car, standing there. So they murdered him, and it was state murder. It was collaborative. It was something that the ruling class media here collaborated with, but that should be expected. I mean, we're talking about a newspaper that used to be called the St. Petersburg Times, where one of the owners of the St. Petersburg Times actually participated in a lynching in this city. What was that, 1914? And then the owner and almost half or maybe what, 3/4 of the white population participated in killing an African right here in this city. So that's the history, that's the tradition. And I just wanted you to be able to meet Deanne Lewis. She calls me her godfather. But she never kissed a ring. Thank you, Deanne. Thank you so much. Yeah. The discussion that we're having now, the comments that you've heard up to now, the discussion around reparations may be one that falls harshly on the ears of some people who are here. And if that's the case, it's only because the United States government succeeded in murdering the people who led an incredibly powerful movement, the 1960s, for the liberation of our people. You know about some of them. You know about King. You know about Malcolm X. You may not know that in 1968 alone, they killed more than 30 members of the Black Panther Party. And by that time, they had arrested more than 300 members of the Black Panther Party. But it was a movement that was silenced. And when I talk about this era of of brutality that we experienced as a movement, I want to remind you that it was during a period that was characterized as one time when revolution was the main trend in the entire world, the 1960s, which meant that the majority of the people on the planet Earth were fighting to be free from European, American, colonial domination. Everybody on Earth was struggling to get out of this stuff. It was happening in Vietnam. It was happening throughout South America. It was happening all over Africa, and it was happening in St. Petersburg, Florida as well. It was a huge movement. And it was a movement that ultimately was crushed. People were murdered. It was crushed in the more vicious way. Not only did they kill people like King, they killed 17-year-old Bobby Hutton, who was a young member of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California. They killed Fred Hampton, who was only 21 years old in Chicago, when they, after having used an agent to put drugs in his Kool-Aid to make sure that he was helpless in his bed when they crashed in at 4 o'clock in the morning, they murdered him in his bed. His wife, who was then something like 8.5 months pregnant in the bed with him, recalls that she could feel the mattress vibrating when they shot through the wall, because they had this agent who had drawn a floor plan to show where everybody was and where everybody slept. So they didn't even have to come into the room. They shot through the walls, and she said she could literally feel the mattress vibrating as the bullets, went into it while she was in bed with him. So it was a brutal, murderous thing, and it was part of what we've identified as counterinsurgency. And counterinsurgency, you may have heard something about it when they talk about how they're going into Iraq, or they went into Afghanistan to engage in counterinsurgency. Counterinsurgency is a method of warfare that employs all kinds of operations. It's psychological warfare, it's economic warfare, it's political warfare, and the basic foundation is of course the gun. It's military, and this is something that was launched against us all around the world. People who were fighting to be free. I'm talking about people who some people have good memories of, that heroic persons. You go back and say what it was that they stood for. What did they stand for? What did Che Guevara stand for when they came to Bolivia, when he was in Bolivia? He had been to Africa, he had been to Cuba, trying to launch movements that would liberate people. What did he stand for, so that when they wounded and captured him, that they murdered him? What did he stand for? Was he robbing banks? Was he taxing the poor? Was he giving all the resources to the rich? What did King stand for, that he had to die the way he did? And of course, Malcolm X and Patrice Lumumba in Congo, and Kwame Nkrumah in East Africa, and West Africa rather. These were figures who simply were struggling to win freedom, happiness for our people. And they were killed. The United States government did it. The United States government did it. And it was a part of a counterinsurgency. And when they killed the revolutionary leaders, they replaced the revolutionary leaders with people who are commonly called sellouts and neo-colonial forces, and they took revolution off the agenda. They raised an entire, more than 2 generations of forces who would represent the interests of white power in our community as opposed to our power. Think about this. There's an election happening in a few days, and people are very excited about it because there's a possibility there might be a black governor of the plantation. So, but think about this. There was a time when a serious movement was happening in this country. King was talking about Poor People's March and a Poor People's Campaign to raise up the impoverished people in this country. Malcolm X was talking about a revolution, the Black Panther Party, 10-point program. JOMO, the organization that we built, and have revolutionary programs. And so what you saw was, it was only 1965 before universal suffrage occurred in this country, before everybody had a right to vote. That's when the Voting Rights Act was passed, 1965. But look at the period of murder and the assault on the revolution in this country. Right at that period of time, they were killing off revolution. They were killing Malcolm, killing King, killing revolutionaries all around this country, killing Panthers, etc. And then after they killed the revolutionaries, killed the programs that the revolutionaries stood for, then they say, you got a right to vote. You can vote now. But you had nothing to vote for. You had nobody to vote for. Your party has been destroyed. Now the only thing you got is a Democratic Party, which, by the way, at that same time was the party of George Wallace, who was a rabid, frothing at the mouth white nationalist in Alabama. So this is what we were left with. And then, of course, they silenced the revolutionaries. They terrorized people. There are people still in prison, as was said, from that moment. There are people who were murdered. I mentioned Panthers. The co-founder of the African People's Socialist Party was one of them. I was in and out of jail so often I had to read the newspapers to locate where I was. That's how serious it was during this period of time. So they crushed the revolution. Nobody's talking about revolution. Everybody was coming up with a reason why you should sell out. Everybody's saying, what you really need to know how to play the game. You see, you just didn't know how to play the game. And anybody who's ever played a game knows that house always wins. You know, the house always wins. You never win like that. And, of course, it wasn't a game. And lives were at stake, oppressed peoples around the world. And we still haven't escaped that situation. Not only African people here, but oppressed people around. Just mention, thousands of people are dying daily in Yemen. The people who are dying right now in Iraq, Afghanistan. I don't want to hear anything about a terrorist in Afghanistan. I mean, the issue is that they are now living under military occupation. It's a U.S. white nationalist occupation in Afghanistan. What gives the United States the right to invade that country and take it over? Or Iraq, or any other place on the planet Earth. So I just think it's really important, you know, I want to contextualize some of this, because the reason, if it's falling on ears with some kind of alarm, it's because the revolution has been quieted for a very long time. You haven't had an opportunity to hear it. It's one of the reasons some time ago, after the defeat of the revolution, I'm talking about more than two generations, we've gone without African people having access to the revolution. Best you can get is a newsreel flick of the Black Panther Party or something like that. So, talking about solving the problems of the revolution, the white people have been the greatest problem we've had of the revolutionary movement. That's been the fundamental contradiction, because we've always had to fight in isolation. Yes, I know there were 6 white people who died over here. I'm talking about in general, the white people have been the ones opposed to revolution. I'm talking about the same people who are now giving Trump a 41 or 47% poll rating today. And precisely because of what he stands for. You know what Trump stands for. They know what Trump stands for. And so that's been a real contradiction. And our struggle gets isolated. We talk about the murder of people like Fred Hampton. Fred Hampton was 21 years when on December 29th, 1969, 4 o'clock in the morning, with the assistance of the FBI, the Chicago Police Department shot their way into the home and murdered him and Mark Clark. And then, where was the white movement? Where was the white movement in 1996, 97, November of 96, when more than 300 police attacked this building right here, attacked this building with cops from all over this area and state troopers. And they said why they did it. They said they didn't want us to say anything about the verdict, that the decision that the grand jury had made not to indict the murderers of 18-year-old Tyrone Lewis. This is why you couldn't hear from us. 300 cops. They used every bit of tear gas in the city of St. Petersburg, all the tear gas they had in their arsenal. They set houses on fire. They tried to set this building on fire when they did it. You see, this is the reality. So we said we need to, and there was no, where were the ACLU, the Constitutionalists, the liberals? Where the hell were you? The free speech persons, you were not to be found. And so what it meant is that our struggle was constantly being isolated. So we are trying to make this struggle. There was an attack. Jesse will tell you about this when, I've forgotten the year, it wasn't that long ago, when they said this youngster who had just turned 16 had killed a white cop. And they had the Homeland Security. They had all kinds of cops. They didn't even know who it was they were looking for. Think about this. They didn't even know who they were looking for. They stopped every car coming into the African community. They stopped buses and boarded the buses. They stopped taxi cabs and looked in their trunks and what have you. And they had tanks in the city. And there were white people saying, that's a lie. There are no tanks in the city. Don't tell me there were no tanks in this damn city. There were tanks, in this community. They went door to door. They did door-to-door searches, not even knowing who the hell they were looking for. So it wasn't about finding somebody who was terrorizing this community. They told people, you can't come out in your yards in this city. And so you have white people who can be oblivious to this stuff, and they will tell you if they killed him, he must have done something. This is a common refrain that we hear from the white community because there's a different reality that white people experience in this country. So the solidarity movement was directed to organize what we first characterized as African People Solidarity Day, to take this out to the white community, to white people, have white people come to be able to express solidarity with African people in this country, and did it for many, many, many years. And it was a difficult struggle just in terms of getting white people to go out. I'm talking about white people who shout to the skies how much they love peace and nonviolence and all kinds of stuff like that. But they would never come out. They're in this city now. They won't come out to a day in solidarity. They won't come out day in reparations. They will not bring their little lily white asses out. And so that's what we've begun. But something has changed now in the world. And what has changed, obviously, in the world is that this whole social system is experiencing a severe crisis that is visible to everybody, even though we are getting different kinds of narratives about what is the basis of the crisis and even what the crisis is. But it's clear that we're looking at a state of crisis. Trump is an example of the crisis himself. He's a manifestation of the crisis himself. And we're living in a period of permanent warfare. Been now fighting in Afghanistan, killing in Afghanistan, occupying, 17 years now. That is incredible. And they can't stop making war. They have to make war. And even as they're doing all of this, they're destroying the very earth that we stand on. And so either people faced with dying as a consequence of the brutality and vicious oppression that most of us are experiencing, or as a consequence of an attack on the very environment, a profit-motivated, profit-based attack on life itself for the entire planet. I want to just say something because I don't want to be heard as just somebody who is ranting and in many ways saying some of the obvious. I think that it's really important for us to have an understanding of the basis of what it is that we're looking at. And that's why I'm saying that I don't give a damn about race or racism, who likes me or not. It's not even about that. It's not even about that. We live under colonial domination. And when you're talking about colonialism, you're talking about the question of power. Who has power over our lives? How did we lose power as African people over our lives? What the hell happened that we no longer have power over our lives? Why is it that every place you look on the planet Earth, not just here on the south side of St. Petersburg, that they have now characterized Midtown or what have you, but any place on the planet, you see Africans are without power over our own lives. And of course, the explanation given to us by our oppressors and the ones who run the world is that there has to be some kind of moral or intellectual deficit on the part of African people, which explains why we don't have power. But I want to say that in truth, white people are relatively new to civilization. And Africans have amazing civilization before white people mastered fire. That's just an objective truth. I mean, you can even find that in the local library if you search hard enough, or Google it, if you will. When we met white people, not just Africans, but most of the other peoples in the world, when we met white people, we met people who lived under feudal domination in Europe, under severe poverty and desperation, who were the next closest thing to slaves. And in fact, in some places around the world, for almost 1,000 years, we are talking about this feudalism. In some places around the world, it was literally true that white people were, to coin a phrase, naked and afraid. Sometimes didn't even have clothing. This is not slanderous, this is true. And so when we met Europeans, it was Europe that was poor. Between the few years, 4 years, 1347, 1352, half the white people on the planet Earth died. Between the period of 1347 and 1352, half the white people on the planet Earth died. A plague. And you cannot lose half a population in 4 short years and have anything that approximates a viable economic life. And then after that, 4 years, you're still talking about another 50, 100 years of that and other plagues still impacting Europe in a very serious way. So how did this change? And of course, what changed it in part was the slave trade and colonialism. Europe rescued itself from disease, from poverty, from oppression through the slave trade and through colonialism. I said Europe did that, but Europe didn't do that because there was no such thing as Europe. What there was that was recognized by some people in this area that now constitute what we refer to as Europe is this group of warring tribes, constantly fighting and warring with each other. And it was who defined themselves primarily in relationship to each other. You know, you had what? The Goths, and you had the Normans and the Celts, and all these different people who were constantly, there was no Europe. What gave them a sense of sameness and created what we now call Europe was slavery. So that when it began the slave trade and colonialism, now these folk began to define themselves not primarily in relationship to each other, but primarily in relationship to us. This is what created the white man. This is what created the European. Because now this entity is being defined in relationship to the rest of us. and this process of slavery. Karl Marx talks about capitalism having come about as a consequence first of the slave trade, which was, and this is really important to understand, the slave trade, which created for the first time a world economy. Not just that people traded with each other, but world trade. They used to call it things like the triangle trade, the world trade, hooked the world up in a single entity, which was incredibly significant for the advent of capitalism as a world social system. And then he talked about how in order for there to be what they call capitalist production, there had to first be capitalist accumulation. But how do you get capitalist accumulation without capitalist production? He said that you locked into this vicious cycle unless you can understand or be able to conceive of an accumulation of capital that was not a consequence of capitalist production, but a starting point. And this starting point, this accumulation of capital that he talked about, was turning Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins. He talked about it interring the indigenous people in this land in the mines, bringing up gold and silver that went to Europe and the rest of that. He talked about it being part of the war that was made against China, 1841 and 42, the so-called Opium War that turned China into a nation of junkies and what have you. In other words, Jesus did not bring capitalism. You understand? It came as a consequence of the rape and pillage of the rest of the world. So you have this world now consolidated like this. Identity is consolidated like this. And the ones with the power are the ones who control and own the slaves. And the economy born of this slave. That's who sets up the schools, the institution that teaches everybody everything they know. That's the one that would not allow any kind of defiance. No kind of defiance. What do you mean? So you can see the pictures of people who've been lynched and murdered. When I was growing up, I literally thought that some Africans I knew, I would see older African people and they looked deformed, physically deformed to me. And they look deformed because a slave who can be murdered and brutalized at a whim, they learn how to act in the most servile way that you can't ever see any defiance in the eyes of this person. Your head down. You're in a permanent state of genuflection when you are dealing with white people. And this is how a nation that's oppressed and brutalized by slavery and colonialism learns to function. And now what happens is the ones who owns the slave master, the oppressor, begins to really believe that's who that person is. Begins to really believe that. But I ain't never been who we are. Never been who we are. And there's never been a time where we did not resist, even if it didn't look like it. You understand? So what's been happening is that there's been crisis after crisis after crisis. And now it's a crisis that's more or less become generalized, where the peoples around the world are taking back their resources, fighting for their resources. When they fight for their resources, it causes an economic crisis. That means the pie is shrinking. So you see greater competition between the rulers of the world. You see a greater desperation in the United States, where the United States, and Trump didn't invent this, you saw that with Bush. Says that we're running everything, we're taking everything, not only from the Africans, not only from the people in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf, but we're taking it from the other white people too. And so now the question of trade, you hear Trump talking about disrupting all of the trade relationships. It's a touchy question today. Who's going to get the loot? You see, the question of immigrants is such an important question today. Who are the damn immigrants? The people who's been pushed out of their lands, out of their countries by capitalism and white power all around the world. They're coming to get back. Even if they're not conscious, that's what they're doing. They're following their own resources. So they can't stop the war. The police can't stop killing African people. Tyrone Lewis was killed. That was 22 years ago. But almost every week you look and you see another killing by white cop, white people, period. Happening on a regular basis. They can't stop it. If they could, they wouldn't do it. And the reason they wouldn't do it because it always creates unrest among the enslaved. So if they could stop it, they'd stop it, but they can't stop it. That's the nature of this beast that we're dealing with, this social system. I want to say this and get out your way. Capitalism is an evil entity. It's a horrible entity. It's horrible. And it has to be destroyed. It's a cancer on it's a cancer on humanity. It has to be destroyed. And most people recognize that. Most people know that capitalism is characterized by at least 3 features. One is based on private ownership of the means of production, right? And even though you have socialized production, as I say, people have to collectively do the producing, you got private ownership. And the people who own it don't do any producing. So you got people who come together to make a car and can't afford to buy a damn car. People who don't make cars, they own the damn cars, right? So they know about that. Capitalism, people will readily talk to you about how capitalism is based on commodity production, which means that things are not produced because people need them. Things are produced for profit. That's why you can't get no health care. I don't give a damn if it's Obama's health care, Trump's health care. Ain't no damn health care in this country. Ain't no health care. You can't have health care under capitalism. Because under capitalism, what they call health care is for profit. It's more profitable for you to have cancer and to keep coming back and keep coming back and keep coming back than to cure it. That's what capitalism does. There's no health care here. They tell you that capitalism is based on wage labor. And this is a really important thing because this is the question where they talk about how exploitation happens at the point of production. Because a person never gets paid for what she produces. She gets paid for her ability to produce, and that's different. Because if you make tables and you get paid for what you would produce, you get paid the value of the table. You don't get paid the value of the table. You get paid enough to get enough food, clothing, and housing for you to come back and make more tables. You get paid for your ability to labor, not for what you have produced. You understand what I'm saying? That's how the thing works. They can tell you that. But the missing ingredient is that all of this that we're talking about, all of this capitalism rests upon this foundation, this mysterious foundation that Karl Marx referred to as the primitive accumulation of capital, that came about not as a consequence of capitalist production, but actually was a starting point. And that's the enslavement of most of the world that's not white, and of slavery and colonialism. That's where it started. And that's why you see such crisis today, because people everywhere are fighting to take back their stuff. And that's why we shouldn't be depressed. I'm telling you, don't let Trump oppress you. I'm telling you, let Trump oppress them. You understand? He is the one that causes depression for the ruling class, even as he's shoveling money and money and money at them. He is mobilizing masses of them. He's mobilizing more oppressed people around the world than Che Guevara. with his activities. And increasingly, that's what you see. And you see that we're doing work in St. Louis as an example. Have an incredible movement in St. Louis, Missouri. And it's just so striking that everywhere we go, at St. Louis, we got work in what they call South Africa. We have party in South Africa, incredible movement, young African people who are organizing under the banner of the African People's Socialist Party and African internationalism. We got organization in Kenya, in East Africa. We got organization in Sierra Leone, in West Africa. We got organization in London or England. We got organization in France. We got some organization in Belgium, etc., and in the Caribbean. It's an international revolution. Capitalism is an international manifestation. It's not just something that exists in Midtown. It's not something that's affecting us, gentrifying, all pushing the African community here. It's a vicious social system that's worldwide, and we have to have a worldwide response to it. I'm saying that they are locked in a very desperate situation. And I am so glad to see you here. Because if you look at what's happening in the world, you can see white people being made extremely desperate. Chairwoman Penny Hess talked about the spike in African and white deaths. It's extraordinary. Suicides, alcoholism, drug addiction, etc. It's what? The disease of despair? And that's how they're calling it. But hell, we've been in despair for I don't know how long, but they never call it that. They call it the reason to have the helicopters fly over and have to be locked up. Our children are in these jails right now. If there's not an African in this room right now at this very moment who doesn't know somebody who's in prison, perhaps some of you, if you don't know somebody, been to prison, got a relative in prison, been to prison, on the way to prison with some kind of relationship, that's our lives. And that's not acceptable. And it shouldn't be acceptable to any of us. And I want to say that when we're having this discussion, we're talking about the emancipation of people, of the toiling masses of the whole world. What I'm identifying is that the strategic location for that struggle is in the African Revolution. I'm not a Dr. King, turn the other cheek, we shall overcome kind of person. Never have been, never will be. I'm not a sympathetic character, I know that. I'm not looking for sympathy. What I need is solidarity. And I don't mean any more solidarity than we've ever shown to anybody. The people in this room can testify. We demonstrated solidarity with the people of Palestine even at a time where the moderate Palestinians didn't want to be able to struggle. We demonstrated solidarity with the people of Iran. And when they took that nest of spies in 1979, when the Iranians took over that, we had, and white people in this country were running around sometimes killing people who, Arabs, because they didn't know the difference in Iranian and an Arab. And then, on the university, one of the premier schools in the state of Florida, the college kids were out, having bonfires and chanting, "Sand niggers go home," or "Send the Klan to Iran." This is what they were doing. This party led a demonstration to thousands of flag-waving, frothing at the mouth white people who were chanting "America and America and America." And this party, and got physically attacked the first time and did it again in solidarity with the people of Iran and the Iranians who were catching hell here. When the people in Nicaragua made a move to try and take their freedom back from this U.S.-supported dictator, Somoza, this party turned over all the resources that we had to the Nicaraguan revolution because we were in solidarity with the people to win their freedom from imperialism, because we knew that a victory for them was a victory for us. This is our history. So I'm not talking about just some narrow nationalist expression. We are African internationalists. But we understand that the critical thing that's going to destroy capitalism and lead to a new world is the liberation of African people, which is global, because we are everywhere. Africans are everywhere, sometimes laboring under false national consciousness. So we call ourselves Jamaicans, we call ourselves Haitians, we call ourselves Ghanaians, we call ourselves Congolese, we call ourselves Afro-Americans, we call ourselves Black Brits, we call ourselves Afro-French, Afro-Swedes, we call ourselves Afro-Colombians, all these other names. And there are places, and there's a false national consciousness. You cannot get on a boat in Africa in 1619 or earlier as an African and then get off in Jamestown, Virginia as a Negro. If we were Africans when we got on that damn boat, we were Africans when we got off that boat. You understand? And that's really crucial. It's really critical for us to understand that. We got African people who live in places like Cameroon, they call it Cameroon. Who called it Cameroon? The Portuguese called it Cameroon. Why they call it Cameroon? That's in West Africa. They call it Cameroon because they found a lot of shrimp there. And the word Cameroon comes from the Portuguese word for shrimp. So you got a lot of Africans running around calling themselves shrimp, but they're not shrimp, damn it, any more than I'm an Afro-American. You can't be an African and an American at the same time. That's a contradiction in terms. And there are other stories. I mean, you look at a place like Nigeria that was dominated by the British, still is in many ways, the British and Americans now. And what we see is that there's a man named Frederick Lugard who really is the architect of neocolonialism. And neocolonialism, which is indirect rule. And Lugard had been preaching indirect rule. Listen, we don't have to have the normal colonialism where the white man stands over. We create indirect rule. We pick Negroes, we pick Africans to run it for us. And so he was sent to these territories, two of the territories, contiguous territories that was controlled by England, at a time where this barren rock that's called England controlled 25% of the world's population and 25% of the earth's territory. And he was sent there to turn it into an administrative whole. And with him was the woman he was to marry. And her name was Flora, what was it? Shaw. And he was looking for a name for the place. And she came up with the idea of calling it nigger area. And that's where Nigeria comes from. These proud, noble Negroes, that's where it comes from. This is how we've been named. This is how my father didn't even know his damn name and had the name of a white man a vicious pig who owned him as property and handed that name down to me. Part of the first act of decolonization was shedding that name. I am not Joe Waller. Shed that name. I'm an African. My name is Omali Yeshitela. And I approve this message. So, I'm just saying that this is an extraordinary important time, and none of us should despair. This is our time if we take it. You're just ahead of the curve, a little bit. You're just ahead of the curve. Others are going to be with you, I'm telling you. They're going to be with you because people are trying to find a way. That's why they went to Trump. Many of them went to Trump because people are tired of this mealy-mouthed BS that they get from the traditional politicians. That's why they went first to Obama, because they thought they had something there. And then they go to Trump. And that's why they went to Bernie Sanders, who will give you $15 an hour over a number of years, as he calls it socialism. And so, but people are looking for real solutions. And Trump is not going to work. It's not, I'm telling you it's not going to work. I'm telling you, not only is it not going to work, all of this stuff they're talking about, this great economy, you'll see how great this economy is. It can't stand a hiccup. It can't stand a cold, not less the flu. If anything comes through, this economy is going down the drain because the people, it depends on being able to continue to steal the labor from the oppressed peoples around the world. So let's go ahead and build this movement. And I want to thank you so much for listening to me. And I want to express appreciation to Uhuru Solidarity Movement and to African People's Solidarity Committee and all of you who've come out. You should join this movement and you should help to build the Black Power Blueprint. That's one aspect of it, but we're building it everywhere we are located. We're not looking for charity. The question is being able to acquire economic development, you know, for our people, for the entire African nation. This is your movement. I'm very glad you came tonight. Uhuru.